The thermometer outside the weather station read -67 degrees Fahrenheit when Marcus Chen made the decision that would either save his life or end it. He had been a meteorologist for 14 years, stationed in the remote wilderness of northern Alaska, and he had seen cold before. But nothing like this. The kind of cold that turned exhaled breath into ice crystals before it could dissipate. The kind of cold that made exposed skin freeze solid in under 2 minutes. The kind of cold that, according to every survival manual ever written, no human being could endure for more than a handful of minutes without proper shelter. The research station's main generator had failed 3 hours earlier, and the backup had sputtered out 90 minutes after that. Marcus had tried everything. He had checked the fuel lines, cleaned the spark plugs, bled the air from the system. Nothing worked. The temperature inside the station was already dropping, had already fallen to 20 degrees, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had perhaps 6 hours before the interior matched the exterior. 6 hours before the station became a tomb of ice and metal. The emergency radio was dead. The satellite phone had frozen solid despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. He was 43 miles from the nearest human being, and the storm that had brought this unprecedented cold front was forecast to last another 72 hours. Marcus stood in the dimming light of the station's battery-powered emergency lamp and looked at his options. He could stay inside and hope the generator somehow miraculously restarted itself, or he could go outside into conditions that every piece of scientific data said would kill him. He thought about his daughter Emma, who was 7 years old and living with her mother in Seattle. He thought about the promise he had made to her before taking this posting, that he would come home in the spring and teach her how to identify clouds. He thought about how his ex-wife would tell Emma that Daddy had frozen to death in Alaska because he had been too stubborn or too stupid to accept that some situations have no solutions. But Marcus had spent his entire career studying weather patterns, and he remembered something from the geological surveys of this region. There was a thermal anomaly approximately 3 miles northeast of the station, a place where ground temperatures registered significantly higher than surrounding areas even in the depths of winter. The scientists who had discovered it theorized it was caused by geothermal activity, perhaps a dormant volcanic vent, or a hot spring system deep underground. No one had ever investigated it thoroughly because it was located in dense forest terrain, considered too dangerous to access during winter months. 3 miles, in -67 degrees, through a forest where the trees themselves were groaning and cracking from the extreme cold. Before we go any further into Marcus's impossible journey, I want to take a moment to connect with all of you watching this from around the world. Whether you're in a warm climate and can't imagine this kind of cold, or you're in the middle of your own winter right now, drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from. It means everything to see how far these stories travel. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button right now because we share survival stories like this every week, real human beings facing impossible odds. Leave a like if you're invested in finding out whether Marcus makes it to that mysterious warm spot in the frozen forest. Now, let's get back to the most dangerous decision of his life. Marcus packed everything he could carry. 4 thermal blankets wrapped around his core, 3 layers of wool underneath his Arctic parka, chemical hand warmers stuffed into every pocket, his emergency flare gun, a compass because the GPS units had all failed. He filled a thermos with the last of the hot water from the dying heating system and tucked it inside his inner jacket layer. He knew the water would freeze eventually, but those first 30 minutes of warmth against his chest might be the difference between maintaining core body temperature and hypothermia. He taped his face shield to his hood to eliminate any gaps where the wind could penetrate. He double-checked his boot insulation. Then he stood at the door and felt his hands begin to shake, not from cold yet, but from the pure biological fear of what he was about to do. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a physical force. It was pain, immediate and all-consuming. The air was so cold it burned his lungs even through the layers of fabric covering his mouth and nose. He could hear his breath crackling, literally freezing in the air around him. The wind was mercifully calm, which was the only reason this was even remotely possible. Wind at this temperature would have killed him in minutes. He had 3 miles to cover. At his normal hiking pace, 45 minutes. But nothing about this would be normal. He started walking northeast, using his compass because the landscape was entirely white, a complete whiteout where sky and ground merged into a single colorless void. The first 15 minutes were almost manageable. His body was generating heat from movement, and the layers of insulation were doing their job. But then he started to feel the creeping numbness in his toes. Not painful, which was actually worse. Just a gradual loss of sensation that he knew was the first stage of frostbite. He couldn't stop to check them. Stopping meant dying. He focused on maintaining a steady rhythm, 1 foot in front of the other, breathing as shallowly as he could because each deep breath stabbed at his lungs like ice picks. The forest around him was utterly silent except for the occasional crack of a tree splitting from the cold. Several times he passed massive pines that had simply exploded, their trunks shattered by the expansion of frozen sap. At the 30-minute mark, Marcus realized he was in serious trouble. The numbness had spread from his toes to his feet, and his fingers inside his triple-layer gloves were losing dexterity. Worse, he was starting to feel warm. He knew what that meant. Paradoxical undressing, the phenomenon where hypothermia victims feel hot and begin removing their clothing in the final stages before death. His brain was malfunctioning, convinced that he was overheating, when in reality his core temperature was dropping toward lethal levels. He forced himself to keep the layers on, forced himself to keep moving, even as his mind insisted that he needed to shed the coat, that he was burning up. Every step was a battle against his own confused nervous system. He checked his compass again and realized with horror that he had been veering west. He had covered nearly 2 miles, but had drifted off course, which meant he was farther from the thermal anomaly than he should have been. He corrected his bearing and pushed forward, but his legs were becoming unresponsive. He was stumbling every few steps, catching himself against trees whose bark was so cold it felt like touching a live electrical wire, even through his gloves. His vision was starting to narrow, darkness creeping in at the edges. He had maybe 10 minutes of consciousness left, maybe less. He thought about Emma again, about how she would be told her father had died alone in the worst cold Alaska had seen in a century. The thought made him angry. Anger was good. Anger generated heat. Anger kept him moving. Then he saw something that made no sense. Steam, rising from the ground about 50 yards ahead, visible even in the dim Arctic twilight. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, his dying brain manufacturing hope where none existed. But as he staggered closer, he could see it was real. Wisps of vapor rising from the snow-covered ground, which meant heat, which meant the anomaly. He had found it. He forced his frozen legs into something approximating a run, crashing through the drifts, falling twice, and barely managing to get back up. The steam was coming from a depression in the forest floor, a natural bowl surrounded by dense evergreens. When Marcus half fell, half slid into the depression, the temperature difference was immediate and shocking. It was still cold, probably close to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, but compared to the -67 he had been enduring, it felt tropical. The ground here was only partially covered with snow, and in some places he could actually see bare earth, dark and steaming slightly. He collapsed against a rock outcropping and just breathed for several minutes, feeling the relative warmth start to penetrate his layers. His hands were screaming with pain now as circulation began to return, which was a good sign. Pain meant the tissue was alive, numbness meant it was dying. As his vision cleared and his core temperature stabilized, Marcus began to understand where he was. The depression was roughly circular, maybe 40 feet in diameter, and the rocks around its edges were warm to the touch. Not hot enough to burn, but warm enough that snow melted on contact. At the center of the bowl was a small pool of water, unfrozen despite the extreme temperatures all around. He could see steam rising from its surface. The trees surrounding this place were evergreens, but they were different from the surrounding forest. Taller, healthier, their branches actually showing green needles instead of the frost-killed brown of the trees he had passed on his journey. Marcus crawled closer to the pool and carefully removed one glove to touch the water. It was warm, genuinely warm, probably 90 degrees or more. A hot spring fed by geothermal heat from deep underground, creating a microclimate that defied every law of the frozen hell surrounding it. He had heard of such places existing in Yellowstone and Iceland, but finding one here, in this exact location when he needed it most, felt like discovering proof of divine intervention. He knew that was irrational. This was geology, not theology. Heated groundwater rising through fissures in the rock. Simple physics. But his hands were shaking as he dipped them into the warm water, and it wasn't from the cold anymore. He spent the next hour carefully warming himself. Not too fast, because rapid temperature change after severe hypothermia could trigger cardiac arrest. He removed his outer layers piece by piece, checking for frostbite damage. His toes were the worst, blackened at the tips, probably second-degree frostbite. He would lose some tissue, maybe a toenail or two, but he would keep the toes themselves if he was careful. His fingers had fared better, just superficial frostbite that would heal. His face was raw and wind-burned, but intact. He was alive. Against every statistical probability, against every survival expert's prediction, he was alive. As night fell completely, Marcus made shelter using the thermal blankets and some dead wood he found near the pool. The wood here wasn't frozen solid like the trees outside the depression, which meant he could actually break it into manageable pieces. He built a small fire using the emergency matches from his pack. The fire was almost unnecessary, given the ambient warmth from the springs, but the light and the psychological comfort were valuable. He melted snow from the edges of the pool to refill his water bottles and drank carefully, knowing dehydration was almost as dangerous as hypothermia. He ate one of his emergency ration bars and felt his strength beginning to return. Sitting by the fire in this impossible warm oasis, surrounded by lethal cold, Marcus had time to think about what had happened. He had made a decision that 99 people out of 100 would have called suicidal. He had walked 3 miles in conditions that should have killed him in minutes, and he had survived because he had remembered one detail from a geological survey, had bet his life on the possibility that theoretical geothermal activity might create a survivable refuge. It was the kind of story people would question when he told it. The kind of coincidence that seemed too convenient to be real. But Marcus knew the truth was more complex than luck or coincidence. He had survived because he had refused to accept that his situation was hopeless. He had survived because he had kept moving when his body and brain were both screaming at him to lie down in the snow and sleep. He had survived because he had used knowledge instead of panic, had trusted data over fear. And yes, he had been lucky that the thermal anomaly was real and reachable, but luck only matters if you live long enough to benefit from it. Staying at the station would have been the safe, rational choice right up until the moment he froze to death inside it. The night was long and strange. Marcus dozed fitfully by the fire, waking every hour or so to add more wood and check that his shelter was holding. The temperature in the depression stayed relatively stable, probably hovering around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which felt absolutely balmy compared to the outside world. He could hear the wind occasionally howling through the forest above the rim of the bowl, and a few times he heard the sharp crack of more trees splitting from the cold. Each sound reminded him that he was surrounded by an environment that wanted him dead, that he was only alive because of this geological anomaly, this strange accident of volcanic heat and underground water. By morning, the storm had not abated. If anything, the wind had picked up, creating conditions that Marcus knew would make the temperature feel closer to -90, with wind chill. He was trapped here, at least temporarily, but trapped with water, shelter, and relative warmth. He could survive for days if necessary. Weeks, potentially, though food would become an issue. He still had 6 emergency ration bars and some freeze-dried meals that he could prepare using the hot spring water. More importantly, he was alive to have these problems. The alternative had been freezing to death within hours. Marcus spent the day improving his shelter and treating his frostbite injuries. He used strips torn from one of the thermal blankets to dress his toes, keeping them clean and watching carefully for signs of infection. He built up the walls of his shelter using stones from around the pool, creating a windbreak that would hold heat more effectively. He experimented with positioning and found that by sleeping within 3 feet of the pool, he could maintain a comfortable temperature throughout the night without keeping a fire going constantly, which would conserve his limited wood supply. He was settling into survival mode, the mindset he had been trained for, but had never actually needed to use. On the second day, something unexpected happened. The wind shifted, and for about an hour in the late afternoon, the air cleared enough that he could see the sky. It was crystalline blue, heartbreakingly beautiful, and the sun cast long shadows across the snow. In that moment of clarity, Marcus used his emergency mirror to send signals toward where he knew the weather station was located. He had no idea if anyone could see them, but it was worth trying. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in Morse code, the universal distress signal. He repeated it until his arm was tired and the clouds rolled back in. What Marcus didn't know was that his signal had been seen. A supply pilot making a high-altitude flight had noticed the flashes and reported them to search and rescue. By the 3rd day, Marcus heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. He scrambled out of his shelter and fired both of his emergency flares, the bright red stars arcing up through the gray sky. The helicopter circled twice, located him, and found a clearing about half a mile away where they could attempt a landing in the still dangerous conditions. The rescue was quick and professional. The crew were amazed to find him alive, coherent, and in relatively good condition. They kept asking how he had survived 3 days in the worst cold front in Alaska's recorded history. Marcus told them about the thermal anomaly, about the hot spring and the microclimate. He showed them his frost-bitten toes and explained his treatment regimen. He described the walk from the station, the hallucinations, the paradoxical warmth that had nearly made him strip off his clothing and die in the snow. The lead paramedic just shook his head and said Marcus was either the luckiest or the smartest man he had ever pulled out of the Arctic. Marcus thought it was probably a bit of both. The story made national news. Meteorologist survives, -67 degrees in remote Alaska. There were interviews and questions about how he had known about the thermal anomaly, whether he had planned for this possibility. Marcus explained patiently that he hadn't planned anything, that he had simply remembered a detail from research files and made a desperate gamble. The Geological Survey team that had originally documented the anomaly was interviewed. They confirmed that, yes, they had identified unusual thermal readings in that area, but they had never imagined it would create such a significant warm zone. And they certainly had never recommended it as a survival shelter because accessing it in extreme conditions was considered impossible. But Marcus had done the impossible. He had walked into cold that was supposed to be unsurvivable and found warmth where warmth shouldn't exist. He lost 3 toenails to frostbite and had some minor scarring on his fingers, but he kept everything that mattered. More than that, he came home to Emma in the spring, just like he had promised, and taught her about clouds and weather patterns and the thin line between rational risk and suicidal stupidity. He told her about the strange, warm place deep in the frozen forest, and she asked him if it was magic. Marcus thought about that question for a long time before answering that maybe it was, in a way. The magic of geology and chance, and the human refusal to quit even when quitting seems like the only logical choice. Years later, the thermal anomaly became something of a legend in the meteorological community. Scientists who studied extreme cold environments would reference Marcus's story as an example of microclimate refugia, places where unique geological conditions create pockets of survivability in otherwise lethal environments. The area was officially designated on geological maps and even became a minor tourist destination in the summer months, though visiting in winter remained dangerous and was generally prohibited. Marcus himself returned once, 5 years after his ordeal, in late August when the temperatures were mild and the forest was green and alive. He stood at the edge of the depression and looked at the pool, still steaming slightly even in the summer warmth, and felt the same sense of awe he had experienced when he first stumbled into this place with minutes to live. The question people always asked him was whether he would do it again, whether he would make the same choice if faced with the same situation. Marcus's answer was always honest. He didn't know. In the moment, trapped in a failing station with temperatures dropping toward unsurvivable levels, walking into the storm had seemed like the only option. Looking back with hindsight and survival, it seemed insane. But insanity and courage often look identical in the moment of decision. The difference only becomes clear afterward, when you're either dead or telling the story to people who can't quite believe you lived through it. Marcus had lived through it. He had found the strange place deep in the frozen forest, the place where the earth's heat defied the sky's cold, and it had saved his life when nothing else could. The thermal anomaly is still there, still warming that small circle of ground in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The pool still steams on the coldest days, still creates a microclimate where life persists against impossible odds. And somewhere in Seattle, Emma Chen knows that her father walked 3 miles through -67 degrees because he refused to accept that some problems have no solutions, because he trusted data over fear, and because when everyone said no one survives that kind of cold, he found the one place where survival was possible. She knows that bravery sometimes looks like stupidity, and miracles sometimes look like geology, and the line between giving up and pressing forward can be as thin as the difference between death and life. That's the real lesson of the strange warm place in the frozen forest, the lesson that matters more than the temperatures, or the distances, or the frostbite scars. Sometimes survival isn't about being stronger or smarter, or better prepared than everyone else. Sometimes it's just about refusing to accept that the story is over until it actually is, and trusting that somewhere in the frozen darkness there might be warmth waiting if you can just keep moving long enough to find it.